Hi, I'm Dr. Christy Bemister, and I am a later in life psychologist who spent a lot of early years with my own trauma and complex issues and traveled and did a lot of mind body experiences and experiences out of the frame of regular medicine and did a lot of healing in those years and then decided to go back to school to educate myself about not only my own experiences but how I might be able to help people through their own experiences of trauma and pain. And so now I've been doing these kinds of things for decades, and I hope my skill and experience will help you in your own life and path to recovery, to the best quality of life you can have. Right now, I'd like to speak about complex pain and how it actually happens because of long-term stress. Long-term stress for many of us are childhood stressors. And when I had started therapy with my first very good therapist, and you might be able to relate to this, having to look for that right person initially. But when I found that person, she would often say to me things like, "So do you think your childhood was stressful?" And I would go, "Oh no, I had a great childhood." And in my childhood, I had a pretty severe fire accident when I was 4. And I lived with a brother who was unfortunately on the spectrum, who was violent. And although I had siblings and we cared about each other, and I had parents who didn't quite understand how to manage the situation, on the outside, it actually looked like we were all coping just fine. But the internal struggles were real and extreme. And so most of us grow up with this awareness and understanding and feeling like my life's ordinary. I just had parents and siblings, and there was always enough food to eat and never had to worry about a roof over my head. I know other people do and have, and that can lead to their stress. But early stressors, and the reason we don't really think of them as early stressors is because they're ordinary to us and that we live them. They're a lived experience, and we actually live through them for the most part. And because we live through something, it normalizes. And oh, okay, fine. This is just normal. It's just normal that my brother is abusive. It's normal that there's no stability in the house. That's just normal. So then I move into a world of extreme instability in my life and think that's normal. So the therapist, and I've done this many times with people over the years, and you can consider this for yourself too. Have you thought your early life was normal, that it was ordinary, that it was fine, that, it's not really any stressors? But if you look back, and especially if you can compare that to other people, of course, always somebody has it worse. And I'm not taking anything away from those people. But the idea of when you look back, how were you as a kid? What were your stressors as a kid? Did you have parents you were able to speak to about problems? Did you have siblings that were mean? If you had siblings, were you the first one? If you're the first one, likely you're going to have a lot more responsibility than if you're the last one. If you're the last one and there's several siblings, you're going to feel like the baby and nobody ever listens to you probably. Whatever the issues are, our body is a record keeper. And so trauma doesn't always have to look like abuse. Abuse, we get hit. Abuse, we get screamed at. But trauma can be different than that. It can also be neglect. It can be that you need glasses and nobody's caught it, and you're in school and you can't read and you can't because you can't see, but you don't know you can't see because you've never had any other experience. And so those kinds of things can stress our system and can stress our brain. And early on, we begin to have this kind of negative thinking, or even just sort of a worried kind of thinking. We get worried. If you can't see and you're going to school and you know you're going to have to read, that's very worrying for a child who's going to only say, I can't read. They're not going to say, I can't see, because they don't know that they can't. Um, so these kinds of things, they just compound over and over. And it leaves a child having to solve problems themselves, usually too early. And so there's a stress response that comes along with a child who's got to solve a problem in life too soon or without help. That child becomes can become emotionally dysregulated because they run a high fear or they run anxiety. They're worried. They're always trying to solve the problem ahead of time. Okay, if I go to school and if I'm really quiet, maybe my teacher won't call on me and they won't see me and I can get away with another day of not having to read. If there's no parents at home to intervene, to be able to see, acknowledge that there's something wrong here, the child really is left to their own devices. Children can only think bad about themselves when they're young, when we're young. We have to have our elders, our older folks, our parents to take care of us. And so it's just an instinct that we have that if something's going wrong in the world, it's our fault. It's my fault. I did this. I caused this. I'm not able to read versus, wow, there's a real problem here that I'm not able to read. And so the level of ability to solve problems is not mature. It's just a low level of ability to really solve problems in a way that are resonant with the body. And so most problem solving then ends up in an anxious circle, in an anxious cycle. I've got to solve all the problems of the universe because then if I solve them all, I can be safe. I know every aspect of everything and how it's going to operate, which it puts me in control. Then when it goes right, I'm not a bad person anymore. Of course, if it goes wrong, I am suddenly a bad person again, and there's something wrong with me. This can lead to self hatred also, especially in teenage years. A lot of acting out in teenage years is because the person doesn't have boundaries or limitations and can't really feel themselves, doesn't really know themselves. And without the boundaries, without the limitations, and the self awareness, really, which is self awareness more than anything else, there is can be a scattered way of thinking, but also an emotional dysregulation. When emotions are dysregulated, the mental cognitive mind is offline, basically, because emotional dysregulation has a lot to do with the fight or flight response. In a fight or flight response, we're not supposed to think, we're just supposed to act and respond. When our fight or flight response is turned off and we've got our mind and our logic, we can solve problems and do a much better job at actually understanding if something is the right action, it's the right thing to do for ourselves. But when we're younger and the emotions get the best of us because they're not really regulated, we don't have the best problem solving skills. And so it's difficult to go to school and succeed. It's difficult to join teams and follow through. It's difficult to meet deadlines. Life just becomes very disorganized. Or on the flip side, actually becomes hyper organized. So there's the kids who fall out and they're really out of control. There are the other kids, though, that they become hyper controlling and they very rigid in their thinking. They can only do things a certain way. They can only eat certain foods. They can only go to school and get A's. That as long as they can contain their world that way, then they're going to be okay. But either end of this particular spectrum starts to cause chronic dis-ease in the body. And that the judgment on the self, the shame that's put on the self is extreme. And that is the stress. That is the primary stress from young childhood that happens is that I'm going to say disrespect, but also the dismissal of self, that our needs don't get recognized. We don't recognize we have needs. And if we do have needs, there can be a way of ending up being really needy. And so we end up really needy or really controlling. But life isn't relaxed. Life isn't good. And the older we get, the more these become integrated in our systems. Many, many young people who are addicted to substances, it's because they are self medicating the inability to manage their emotions because they didn't grow up managing their emotions. And managing addiction also, you need a regulated system. You need the brain to come online to be able to say, I want to live my life differently. Even then, it's kind of a difficult thing. But something that leads to addiction, then, as I've said in other videos, can lead to chronic pain. So if you're somebody who actually suffers from low esteem, low self-esteem, or substances, including things like you really need to shop and things feel out of control at certain points, just allow yourself to breathe, just with that thought of here's a way that I think I'm out of control or can be out of control. And spend just a few seconds breathing into that idea that you could settle, that you could take a breath rather than reaching out for something, that you can reach in by taking a breath. This can take a lot of practice over time to actually really bring it to full, to bring your body to full calm and to be able to use this particular technique. But many things, many ways we give ourselves attention. When it's good attention, it can be really effective in lowering our stress and in lowering how negatively we might think about ourselves. In all of those, the inability to really make good decisions. Sometimes just a simple breath and not reaching out so quickly can give us a different perspective on how to move forward. So then over time, this dysregulation begins to become a chronic signaling in the brain, which then leads to a chronic state of disarray in the body. It starts out mentally, emotionally, but then over time, because of the way the body is trying to get your attention, is not working. And so its information processing to you, then it starts screaming louder. You start having more pain. You start feeling even more impulsive. These things amp up because it's the only way that your body has to connect with you and to give you information that it is needing something from you. But to grow up thinking that your body's the problem, that if you just didn't have a body, that if it would look a certain way, that if it could just stop hurting, that if it could just do something different, that you would be better. Doesn't work that way. It's exact opposite, that you and your consciousness have to start approaching your body as if this is a precious thing, which it is. Your body is a precious thing that belongs to you. And it's your job and work in your life to actually begin to read the signs and read its language and to help your own self resolve the problems that come along with negative thinking and making decisions that are not in your best interest and all of that. It's all possible. And it's so important to understand that the pain ultimately comes from the stress, which ultimately comes from dumping chemicals into your system, which comes from causing inflammation in your system long term, and that it's all on a spectrum and all of it from the earliest stressors, the earliest negative thinking to, years, decades later when life just feels kind of unmanageable and it's all changeable. And you might consider right now the tiniest step that you could take to put yourself in a different situation, something as simple as drinking a glass of water. Sometimes just drinking a glass of water can make you feel so much better because our body needs water. And that's a thing I know many of us don't do. I don't do it enough, but I know when I drink some water, sometimes it just feels like a relief. That's a little bit about how trauma and pain and ongoing stress kind of cross over.